computer. Perfect. Well, welcome everyone to Roundabout Books virtual event with Jane Kirkpatrick. My name is Julie. I am the events manager at Roundabout Books. We are so grateful for everyone taking the time on a kind of chilly but still beautiful Bend evening to join us virtually. I am actually in the bookstore today, so if you can see behind me, we have our fiction shelves, and we have some of Jane's previous books available, and we do have copies of the book she's going to talk about tonight. We've already sold through quite a few, so please don't forget, you can always call us and reserve a copy or through our website. So let's see here. I'm actually going to not read the synopsis of this book because I want Jane to be able to talk about it herself. But I want to remind everyone that she's written more than 30 books, including One More River to Cross, which she talked about last year in our store, and it was one of the best events I had been to. Jane, you had mentioned a book, I think it was called Writing Your Life, something similar.
Oh, yes,
Does that
yes,
sound right?
yeah.
I picked it up, so I have to tell you that yes, it's been very helpful for my writing clients. But again, we're so excited to have you with us tonight. People might still be joining the event as we go. This is being recorded and will be on our YouTube channel. So if anyone misses anything, or you know a friend who wasn't able to make it tonight, please direct them to our YouTube channel. But otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jane to talk about Something Worth Doing.
Well, thank you, Julie. And especially thank you to the bookstore and to Cassie and to all of you who made time to come tonight. As Julie mentioned, it's a lovely day here in Central Oregon, and it was really nice to have air quality in the single digits. So that makes us want to be outside more. So I appreciate that you've come in for that, although maybe some of you are out sitting on your decks, I don't know, with your laptops or whatever. But it's a pleasure for me to be here. And what I usually do is tell stories. And I get to tell you some stories tonight about Something Worth Doing, which is really about Abigail Scott Duniway, who was an early suffragist. And it's really timely in a lot of ways, not only because this is the 100th anniversary, 100 years ago, when the 19th Amendment, when white women received the vote. And so that's pretty significant. And then with the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it just really struck me how Abigail was, for her time, someone like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in that Abigail fought for various rights and fought for the right to vote. And the work that Justice Ginsburg did really expanded on so many rights. I mean, so women can get credit cards, women can join universities that were otherwise excluded to women. And I had this experience in the 1960s back in Wisconsin, at the University of Wisconsin, when I went to the library to get a library card in Madison, hotbed of liberalism, and I couldn't get one unless my husband signed for it. And I've never forgotten that. And so it was people like Abigail and people like Dr. Ginsburg who really made it possible for us to be able to have more rights than we ever even approached. And so I'm grateful to be here talking about Abigail Scott Duniway. And it's basically, most of you know that's what I do, is I tell stories, but you all tell stories too, because that's the most powerful way we have of organizing human experiences. It's why we tell the same stories about, at weddings and even at funerals and celebrations, because that's how we're transferring culture. And one of the delights for me about writing about actual historical women is that often I encounter descendants. And I did not encounter this descendant prior to the book being published, but 2 weeks ago, I spoke to a book group over in Corvallis and learned that Abigail's stepmother, who plays a part in this book, this woman in Corvallis was her great-granddaughter. And so that was really cool to sort of be able to interview her a little bit about some of the family stories that are told and passed down. And I think I got it right in the book from what I told her, so, and what she told me. So that's really been fun to encounter, and one of the gifts of writing about real people. But I think one of the other gifts about writing stories based on real people is that readers have a chance to see how people actually did struggle and how they came through it. And it's not strictly the imagination of the author, but it's actually has factual information that people can check and say, well, how did that really happen? And did she really spend 40 years of her life trying to make this happen? And did she do all these things, even though she had 6 children, when she's married for all these years, had 6 children, 1 girl and 5 boys, which she referred to as 5 voters, because only men could vote. And so she'd say, you know, get your sons out there, that's the voters. And the goal was to try to get men, she had to get men to agree to give women the right to vote. So I thought tonight I would talk a little bit. I'm wearing this banner, which says Votes for Women. I think it says, yeah, Votes for Women. You probably can't see it. But the women used to wear these as a way of bringing up the need for that issue, as it, campaigns that went on for many years. Abigail, Oregon got the vote in 1912, so before the national amendment was passed. But Oregon had 6 campaigns, and the campaigns were like every 2 years. You had to get the legislature to agree to make a referral to vote on it in one session. And then, because Oregon only met every other year, you had to get it in 2 consecutive sessions, and then the 3rd session it would go to a vote. So that happened 6 times, and some people said we had so many campaigns because Abigail could be really strident. But I also think we had that many campaigns because it was just a hard-fought battle here in Oregon or in the Northwest. So I thought I'd tell you 5 stories based on the letters in Votes to keep it in mind, and to also keep reminding us to register and vote, since we have had people who work so hard for that right. So the V stands for vulnerability. And one of the things when I began doing the research about Abigail is most of the material written about her is that she's just really this tough, she ran a newspaper, she ran a business, she was a teacher, she fought for women's rights all these years. And it was just this picture of this really strong, capable woman, which she was. But I also saw the vulnerabilities that really influenced her life choices. And women were very vulnerable in the 1850s and 60s. We were vulnerable financially in a huge way, because if our fathers died and had a debt, the daughters would, if there was a single daughter, that daughter would often be compelled to pay her father's debt. If there were stories that Abigail told about a woman who was divorced by her husband and she had nothing left. There was no law that enabled her to have necessarily alimony or anything else. And she borrowed money from Abigail to buy furniture so she could run a boarding house, because that was one of the few occupations that women were allowed to have that were considered respectable. And so she ran, this woman got the furniture and started running her boarding house, and her ex-husband came back and said, hey, whatever's yours is mine. And so he took that furniture. She still owed money to Abigail, and she now had no way to make her living. And that happened often. Women were very vulnerable and felt unprotected by the laws, and they couldn't get the laws changed unless they convinced men that it was necessary to do that. And a lot of men, basically, particularly legislators, said, we'll take care of you, we'll take care of you. But it didn't happen that way. And Abigail was actually, Ben was her husband, was a good man, but he made some poor financial decisions, and Abigail wasn't protected and their family wasn't protected. And that really in some ways set her forward for becoming much more of an activist than she otherwise might have been. The word vulnerability actually comes to us from a word that means woundedness. And I think that really speaks a lot to what inspires many activists, particularly women, is that they experience the woundedness of the way in which they are treated, and that social injustice gets converted then into some more active activity. So the O stands for being open. Abigail came actually from Illinois. She was one of 12 children. On the trip out in 1852, her mother and a younger brother passed away. And that was pretty traumatic for her. And she had to come to terms with the fact that her mother had not wanted to come. And it was basically go with your husband and your children, or you might never see him again. And so her mother had said to her dad, they had come from Kentucky, and she said, we've always been on the frontier, and finally civilization is catching up with us in Illinois. Why don't we just stay here? But he had the Oregon bug. And if you read Oregon Trail stories, there's this bug that these people got. Women got it too, but more often it was men. And women actually had to make, I think, the greater sacrifice, because so many of them had to leave a certain level of comfort and predictability. And so for many women, they had to find new ways to be open to new things, open to how they would do something different. Abigail did not have the education that her older brother Harvey, or her younger brother Harvey, did. And she just really had maybe a year, maybe two of formal education, because she had to stay at home and help her mother look after the other kids. And she also apparently had some health issues that we don't know exactly what it was, but she didn't have the advantages that her brothers did. And that was not uncommon too. That was another vulnerability, that women no one thought that women needed a formal education. So she actually was self-taught. She read a lot of newspapers. Her parents had a lot of books in their home and took newspapers, and she passed the test. And so her first job was as a teacher. And she hadn't really wanted to get married that soon, but there were some family issues that required basically that the girls move out from their father and stepmother. And so she had fortunately met Ben Duniway, who was this affable, good-looking cowboy type guy and loved horses and singing, and he was the perfect foil for her, really, because he became a house husband and was comfortable in that position and wasn't threatened by the kind of notoriety that his wife eventually acquired. But she became open to teaching, and then when financially things got tough, she decided they should turn their house into a boarding house. And then she started a millinery, and then she started, she had a newspaper column. So she was open to doing whatever it took to support her family and at the same time encourage the rights of women. So T. So the T word stands for tools. And her best tool was that she had a great imagination, and she knew how to put that into place. She wrote over 20 novels. And during the 1850s and 60s, novels it was considered acceptable for novels to be proselytizing. That if you had a particular point of view that you wanted people to get, you could write this sort of melodramatic novel, and that was acceptable. There's a great quote that said, you want to change people's minds, write a novel. And so people were pretty comfortable with having that as what a novel looked like. And she wrote many novels in which there was a poor woman who was taken advantage of, and how by standing up for herself that could change things. So she had a great imagination, and she was very. Another tool she had is that had a brilliant mind, because when she began giving speeches later in her life, she would write the speeches out, but then she would never read them. She'd memorize them and had a very inventive perspective. And the third tool that she had, and this is sort of, some of you know because I often tell this story, this is a coping saw. And so one of her tools was that she was able to cope in a rather significant way. And so a coping saw, for those of you who know the story about my husband and I building a place on the lower John Day River, and he had sent me down to get a hacksaw, and he said, "You know what a hacksaw is, don't you?" And he was kind of grumpy, and I said, yeah. And a hacksaw, for those of you who may know, is the blade goes across at a lower place. And so when I came back, I gave him a saw that looked like this, and then I also gave him the hacksaw, and he was happy. And when he was finished, I said, "Well, what's this called?" And he said, "That's called a coping saw." And I said, "You mean like I have trouble coping with you?" And he said, "Yeah," and it's a good mental health word. So I asked him what it was used for, and he said it's used to fit things into tight places, like the cabinet into a corner or the edges of a picture frame. And he said if it's the blade that makes it coping. So the blade is really strong, but it's also really flexible. That if it's too strong, it'll splinter what you're trying to fit. And if it's too flexible, it'll leave gaps. In order to cope, you have to have both strength and flexibility. And he said it just like that, out in the, the sagebrush. And later a man told me that the blade also allows you to change directions quickly without a lot of friction. And certainly during the volatile times that Abigail lived, and during our volatile times, the ability to know when to stand firm and know when to be flexible is pretty significant. And also the ability to change directions quickly without a lot of friction is really important. I think COVID has required of us that we really find ways to change directions quickly without making lots of chaos for ourselves, because that just adds to the anxiety that we have to deal with. And my neighbors who have young children, and other neighbors who have kids in college, just listening to them talk about the kinds of decisions and not being able to decide until they get more information, that's that coping capability. And Abigail had to employ that often. She lived during that time of the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, and changes in the economy, and right up into the early 1900s. And during all that time, she was also very much working towards getting women to vote. So the E word stands for engagement. And that's a word that actually means to make a promise. And Abigail, at some point in her life, made this promise to herself, but also, I think, to her sisters and her mother. Her mother at one point had said to her how sorry she was that she was a girl, because she knew that girls would have a harder life. And I think Abigail's capacity to stay engaged despite the disappointments and despite the challenges is really a mark of her character. She, the very first campaign was in 1884. And at that point, she had a newspaper, and she had been running a newspaper, which you can actually go online to the New Northwest and read her articles and read her. She would serialize some of her books, but she wrote articles defending the Chinese, or wrote articles about women's rights, or articles about other kinds of contemporary issues, prohibition and so on. And so she stayed engaged in these articles and used that newspaper to try to compel people to think about the vote. And her brother was the editor of the Oregonian. So there was this competition that the younger brother, who graduated from Pacific University, was the first graduate from Pacific University in Forest Grove, which is for those of you not in the area, that's a big university in the Northwest. Was also started by a woman, Tabitha Moffett Brown. So Oregon has some great women pioneers. Anyway, she and her sisters really worked on Harvey to try to get him in as an editorialist to support women's suffrage. And he was not predisposed to do that. Instead, he really thought that women shouldn't be engaged in the kind of dirty world of politics, and that's what he thought would happen if they got the vote. But Abigail convinced him that he wanted to be on the winning side, and she and her sisters were just certain it would pass. They mostly had contact with rural people in Oregon women worked beside their husbands on their farms and doing work, and a lot of the men just didn't see, they saw them as being equal, and they ought to have the right to vote. Whereas a lot of the Portlanders and people in larger urban areas didn't necessarily share that. But they had convinced their brother that he should come out in favor of women's suffrage because he wanted to run for senator at some point. And they said, you got to be on the winning side. So he came out, he endorsed women's suffrage, wrote some really nice articles about it and about trying to allay men's fears. And lo and behold, when the vote came in 1884, it was 2-1 against women getting the right to vote. So Harvey was on the losing side, and even worse for him is that the losing side, the people who voted against it were the Portlanders, that area, the more urban people. So he never forgave her for that. And every other campaign after that, he voted against it, editorialized against it, and he died in 1910. And probably if he hadn't died, we still wouldn't have gotten it, but it passed in 1912. So that was when that long-term engagement, the promise that she kept to herself, was still there. And then the last word in votes is the S word. And that really stands for being a seeker. And one of the things, in having read about a number of women, and particularly women who have this focus and never let it go, they are seeking something. And for Abigail, she really felt it was kind of a spiritual thing. She thought that she was supposed to do this work for women. She writes in her autobiography that there was a moment when she and Ben are talking and this light comes down, and I was telling Julie, I don't know if you can see this light, this shaft of life over here from our solar light. Look, that she said this shaft of light came down, and she just knew that that was what she was supposed to do. And Ben had said, nothing will ever change until women get the vote. And at that point, she stopped working on all kinds of other things and really focused on the vote. And that capacity to seek something, to be purposeful, I think is one of the great strengths of these early activists. I saw an interview recently with Malcolm Gladwell, I think it is. He wrote The Tipping Point, and he has a new book out. But someone was talking to him about some of these people who are just very successful. And he said the two qualities that he identified that were critical for successful people. And one was to be purposeful, to have a purpose. And Abigail definitely had that. It sustained her through all these 40 years for her whole life, to make women's lives better. And she actually thought if a woman's life got better, in whatever way that happened, that would ultimately make it better for the whole family, and that the culture itself would be better if women were if women were treated equally and were able to assume to achieve at the highest levels that they should be allowed to, and not have that be depressed because of their gender. And then secondly, he said that these people are disciplined. And when I thought about that, I thought about Abigail. She wasn't always disciplined in some things. Her sister was a better editor and worked for her for a while. Abigail wrote some articles for the Oregonian, and her brother wouldn't accept them because he said they were sloppy and she needed, she wasn't a very good grammarian apparently. And I have her in the book saying, well, you're the editor, why don't you just edit it? But he didn't do that, he sent it back. So she wasn't always disciplined in some things, but the fact is she was disciplined in meeting that goal. She would get up at 3 and 4 in the morning, work for an hour or two, either writing her book or working on her classroom activities. And then she would get breakfast pulled together for the boarders that they had in the house. And then she would teach school. At some point in their marriage, Ben had a very significant accident, and then that made her not only all these other roles, but also a caregiver. And she was disciplined in all of those parts of her life. And all of that was moving towards having accomplished this purpose. So that's what votes meant in her life, I think. And if we look at our own lives, those are probably pretty similar. The vulnerabilities we have to deal with, being open to new things, identifying what tools we have, staying engaged, and being seekers, finding that purpose that keeps us going and keeps us focused and not become despairing when things all around us look to be falling apart. So I hope that you will find some connection inside this story with in your own life, and that you will realize that there are some things that are worth doing regardless of how they turn out. So how's that? What time? How much time did I take?
That was about a half an hour. That was great.
All right. Okay, not too bad.
So, most people might not know that, books take a good amount of time from, start to actual publication. So did you have an idea of getting this published around, the 100 years of voting rights, or was that kind of a nice coincidence?
It was actually a coincidence, a happy coincidence. When I realized, I usually do the books with a 3-book contract. So I have to submit to my publisher, these are the 3 stories I think I'd like to do. And as it turned out, I had this moment of panic because I'd finished the book, and the marketing said, they always do this big questionnaire by asking all kinds of questions about the characters and so on. And they used the title of the second book. And I'm like, no, that's not what I wrote. I wrote this one. And so they're like, it's okay. We'll go with this one first. And it turned out to be the right year for that. So that was really great.
That's awesome. Well, then let's go ahead and open it up to our attendees. If anyone has a question, you can submit it in the chat, or you can, if you have video, just wave at me and I can unmute you so that you can ask a question. So do we have anybody right away that wants to ask? Yeah, Susie, hold on just 1 second. So it should pop up on your screen. Yeah, go ahead.
So first of all, hi Jane. It's good to see you and hear you again. How many of Abigail's books did you read, her novels that she wrote? And did you have a favorite of those?
So I read 3, well actually 4, because I also read her memoir. And of the other 3 that I read, I have to say that her first one, which now my brain is lost, I can't remember what the first one was, but it was largely based on the Oregon Trail experience. So it was really great to sort of read how she interpreted her journal that she had taken. I also read her journal that she kept on the Oregon Trail, and how she incorporated that into her novel. There was one novel that was really long, and it was in a poetic format, and that was really hard for me to stay with it. I mean, that was not particularly good, I didn't think. And her first novel, I wish why my brain can't, maybe it's in here, but anyway, she got really bad reviews, and that was really traumatizing for her. She felt really badly. It was her first novel, and the reviews were not good. And even her, the newspaper that she had written columns for, they just had an announcement of it. They didn't review it or say, here's our correspondent has her first novel, take a look, whatever. And so she was really disappointed in that. And because it was based on the trip she took across the Oregon Trail, a lot of her relatives in Illinois bought it because it was based on that trip. And so the sales weren't that bad, but she remembered the reviews as not being particularly good. And then when she started the newspaper, that book came out in 1859, the year that Oregon became a state. And it was actually the first commercially published book in Oregon as a state. And so the book came out, and what was I going to say about that? Oops, my mind just went away. It'll come back to me in a minute. Oh, I know. When she started her newspaper, which was 20 years later, so 1871, one of the first things she wrote about was, she said we, everything was in a we, it wasn't I. You know, we have started a newspaper, you know, we are doing this. But one of the things she said is, we wrote a novel and it wasn't all that good. And, you know, so we had bad reviews and they were well-deserved, but we have learned in the last 20 years or something to that effect. So she, even 20 years later, she was still hanging on to those negative reviews, but she was trying to transform them into letting her readers know, I've made some changes. I'm doing better. There's it's a small book, but it's by Deborah Stein, who it might have been a doctoral dissertation in which she evaluates all of Abigail's writing of her novels and kind of talks about the themes that are in there and how she grew as a writer and all of that sort of thing that you might find really interesting. I've listed those books in the back in here under my author's notes. So yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. So we do have a couple of questions in the chat. So let me read one of those. The first one from Marilyn is, have you written any books based on Bend or Central Oregon?
Yes, well, Central Oregon, and that was my first novel, was called A Sweetness to the Soul. And it's based on Jane and Joseph Shearer of Shearer's Bridge, which is actually in Wasco, Sherman County, that on the Deschutes River, but that's considered Central Oregon. And that was my very first book. I'm actually doing some research right now because I think there's some other stories, you know, here that are really good. And I also can highly recommend a book called Little Century, and the author will come to me, but Little Century is technically Bend, and it was set in the early 1900s, and it's one of the best kind of cattle, sheep, strong woman stories. Highly recommend it. So, and I'm terrible about not remember authors' names, so if you don't remember my name, I'm never embarrassed because I can never remember authors' names either. So, but Little Century is the title. Highly recommend that one.
All right. We do have another question. Allison asks, why do you think the women's vote was so unpopular in the urban areas?
I think it was because, especially Portland was kind of considered as the new Boston. There were a lot of what's the word I want? Highbrow people that moved, that came west and settled in the urban areas. And those people tended to be wealthier, and they tended to be more, the roles were more divided, more clearly divided. So they came from places like Boston or New York, where women stayed at home and raised the children, and men went away to do work. And they didn't necessarily blend. Whereas in the rural areas, men and women worked side by side. And I think that was the primary reason. And then the second reason was that they were wealthier people in Portland, in the Portland areas, and they they were financiers, and so they were looking at what would happen with the economy if women got the vote. And one of the big worries was that if women got the vote, they would outlaw alcohol, and that would totally destroy. I mean, Portland had there's some great books about Portland during that time period, that there were, I don't know, 15 bars and 12 brothels, you know, on the main streets. That was it. And Abigail was unique in that she did not consume alcohol herself, but she said, I will fight to the death to allow people to make that decision themselves. And so she was not opposed to, she was not in favor of prohibition. And that later became some consternation between her and the suffrage movement, because a lot of the suffrage people say we have to do both of these. We have to get the women's right and we have to fight for prohibition. And she felt that would be a death knell, and tried very hard to not have that become the voice of women's suffrage in the Northwest. One of the things she did that I didn't mention is that she believed in what was called the still hunt. She didn't like rabble rousing. She didn't like women going into saloons and taking over saloons and that sort of thing as to make their point. The still hunt was an approach of individually meeting with men and women, because those men were going to be making the decisions, and one by one meeting with legislators, you know, talking with corporate groups to try to allay the fears that men had about what would happen if women got the vote. And later in life, after all these campaigns, she took some hits for that because they said she needed to make changes, that still hunt wasn't working. But she really had a hard time giving that up. So, yeah. So I think I think those are the greatest reasons: economics, and then just cultural traditions that people had in Portland that were different than the rural experience.
Right. So we've got one more question in the chat. Linda asks if, Chica wants to know if there's a dog in this book.
Oh, there is a dog, but it's later on in the book. It's when the Dunaways sell their places in Portland or in Oregon and they move to a ranch in Idaho. And I decided that on a ranch in Idaho, they had to have a dog. So they get a dog in Idaho. It comes with the ranch. It's nothing like Chica, who, you know, was like a primary dog of that whole book. So
yeah, if you haven't read One More River to Cross, and we do have copies in stock, we have a famous, canine with us tonight that is central in that book, or, you know, a character.
Yeah.
So
yeah, exactly.
Do we have any more questions? I thought I saw a hand up earlier. Is anyone want to wave at me that you have a question? Oh yes, hold on, Robin. I saw you, so go ahead.
I just want to say hi to Jane. It's Robin Vick. And
hi, Robin. How nice to see you. I was just thinking about you earlier today because you gave me all those letters from some early Bend people.
Yes.
And I know right where they are. And I was telling Jerry, I said, I really need to look at those because maybe this is the next, not the next two, because I've already contracted out, but I need to let my editor know that I'm thinking about some other stories. And I think that could be a really interesting Bend story.
Oh, so that's so exciting. I so hope you do that. Those letters they're just wonderful. They really are. It's the Reed family from Bend, right?
Yes.
So I just want to say a fun fact. My sister Allison and I, who is also part of this, went to Duniway grade school in Portland.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, there are just lots of places named for Abigail. And when the book came out, I got a letter from a woman in Tillamook, and she sent me a picture of she and her husband and their wedding picture. They got married in Abigail's Lafayette house. And so they're right in front of it. At the time, it was a bed and breakfast. I'm not sure it is now, but yeah, and it was just like, how cool is that?
That's fun. Well, I just wanted to say hi and mention that.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
All right, we did have another hand up. Is it Jean or Jeannie? All right, so go ahead and unmute. Let's see. Is it working? There you go.
I notice in your books that you always have strong primary characters, but yet you have great detail around the secondary characters. Can you tell me a little bit about how you decide to develop those and how you know when to stop?
Well, it is a balancing act. The detail is really important for authenticity and for empathy, so that the reader feels like they know those characters. But I have to be really careful. Sometimes there'll be a character that enters the storyline, and I spend too much time with them, and then I have to, in the second, when I go back and do revisions, I have to take them out, or at least not spend as much time with them, because readers will expect that if I spend too much time and give too much detail about a character, you all will expect that that character is going to show up later, or it's going to have more importance. And if they're just kind of a primary character, I think, you know, Sue Grafton and her books, if you read the Alphabet Mysteries, she was just a master at the small character, like the person who was the hotel clerk or something. She could, in one scene, give you this great sense of who that character was, enough detail and often humor that you remember that character, but you didn't expect you'd ever see that character again. And I think that's a great skill that I work at. Some of the minor characters are what I would call composites, because for example, with Abigail's story and some of the others, there's so much historical material about these people, that if I tried to tell all of the relationships that went on, one that was that I had to revise when I did the revisions was Bethina Owens Adair, and she was the first physician in Oregon, first woman physician, and she went back to get her degree in Pennsylvania, and Abigail actually took care of her son during that time. And I really initially thought that I would have a lot of relationship issues between those two, but as the book went on, that became a minor story, because the relationships that were more powerful in the storyline were with her sisters and with her husband and with her brother. So the family became much more significant. And then she had one significant friend that I gave her, and that was a composite as well. And it was based on actually a woman who, for our Presbyterian church one year, I said that I would sell the right. It was a fundraiser to name a character, and that's how Chica became a character in the one book, and then Shirley became a character because another buddy, Jan, at the Presbyterian Church in Bend, she wanted her good friend memorialized, and so Shirley Ellis was made into Abigail's best friend, who lived in San Francisco. So that's the other thing that sort of weaves into the fictional part of, I can make up a character and also raise money for our projects at the First Presbyterian Church. So, but I've also done that for libraries, and that's sort of fun to do it that way, to get some new characters in there.
Great, thank you.
Yeah,
you're welcome.
For that question. So I'm just going to read a couple of comments out of the chat. So Marilyn Miller says, I just want Jane to know I have admired her and her books for years. Thank you. And she wants to know your website. So if you can just tell everyone.
Yes, it's just jkbooks.com.
And then
JK Books.
Jean West says, hi Jane, good to hear you again. Thanks for these virtual get-togethers.
Yes.
And Michelle says, hi Jane, I'm so glad to get to see you tonight on Zoom. Thank you. Hello to Jerry.
All right.
And
I would tell them.
Oh, we have one more, and this is cute because there's quotations. How are you and Jerry coping these days?
Yeah. Yes. Well, we are coping. We're pretty much not quarantined. He goes out mostly just for doctor's appointments. He has 4th stage melanoma, but it is currently in remission as long as he gets immunotherapy. So we're very grateful for advances in cancer treatment. And so I do the shopping, and I go during the old people's hour at Trader Joe's and Whole Foods and other places. And we will be leaving in November to go back to Southern California, near Palm Springs. It's Rancho Mirage, and Jerry gets treatments down there as well. So we will not be spending the winter here. And last year was our first time doing that, and he just did better in the warm weather during the winter. So I think we're coping really pretty well. We're being strong and flexible and ready to make changes quickly. So
that's great. Do we have any final questions? You do such a good job of talking about your books and the history behind them and what inspired you to write them, that almost I feel like, what else can I ask? We do have one more question. Okay. What is next? So are you able to give us a little preview of what you're working on?
Yes, I can give you a preview. I just turned it in. I turned it in September 1st. I'm waiting for my editor's comments. And the working title, of course, most of you know that when I submit a manuscript, I have to give 10 possible titles. And so marketing will meet about that. But my working title is called The Musical Healing of Natalie Curtis. And Natalie Curtis was a child prodigy, professionally trained, classically trained pianist and singer. And she was, ready to head forth that was her whole life from the time she was a child. But when she got into her 20s, and it was a time when women were not allowed to, she either had to, she couldn't do what a man could do and become a professional musician and travel. And so she actually had a breakdown when she was about 25. And so for 5 years, well, I guess she was 20. So for almost 5 years, she didn't do anything. She didn't compose. She didn't do anything. And her brother had gone to the Southwest, and he came back healthy, no longer with asthma. And he said, come west and get healed. And so she did that by having this amazing impact with Native American tribes, and became what's called an ethno-musicologist, and really was able to preserve Indian music, which had been, because of the Assimilation Act and the Code of Offenses, Indian people were not allowed to sing, dance, use their language, all kinds of things. And because of her work and her influence with Teddy Roosevelt, the president, made a significant difference in the lives of Indian people, but also healed herself through the Indian music. So to me, it was just a wonderfully inspirational story about the power of music to unite people and to heal us all. So I hope you'll look for it next September.
Absolutely. And, fingers crossed we can have you in the store.
Yes, that would be very cool.
Yeah, let's do one last question from the chat. Jean West asked, are you ever going to write more series books?
The thing about series is that it really becomes part of the marketing and publisher, sort of the way that publishing is going or not. And so there hasn't been an interest in series books at this point. And so probably not. I've often thought about some of the series that I did do. I thought, it might be kind of interesting to do another book in that series and pick up where I left off. I think that would be kind of fun to do. And if I am unable to get contracts and I'm left of my own deserts to write, I may just write some fourth books in some of those series and see if I can self-publish them perhaps. So that seems to be a trend with a lot of authors these days. So.
Yeah, it is interesting how, unfortunately, sometimes it's, you know, whether or not the publisher will pick up.
Yeah, and publishers are, you know, it's a strange publishing world right now. And of course, you know, with COVID and with everything that's happened, you know, it's all virtual sales. It's really difficult. You know, I'm following a bookstore in Canby, which is, you know, in the Valley, and like every other day they were saying, I think we're going to be open, and then said, no, we're going to have to close. And then the smoke came, you know, okay, we're closed, you know, and I just think how hard that has to be for independent bookstores. Just so hard right now. So anyway,
yeah,
it is,
I know that,
it is a coping required world.
Exactly. Yeah. Cause I know Powell's in Portland has definitely gone through some pains this year. And, you know, as an independent bookstore, I think I can speak for most people that work here. It's our customers that keep us, you know, in the store. And so we're so grateful for everybody who has purchased online, who's called us when we were doing our owl delivery a couple of months ago. We still do it on Thursdays. You know, it was so nice I did a couple deliveries where you just ran up, knocked on their door, put the book down and ran away. But it was still really nice to just be delivering.
There was a connection.
Books that way, exactly. You know, where people would see me at the window and I'd wave and they knew why I was dropping off books. You know, it's such a symbiotic relationship between our authors, local especially, and our customers. So on that note, again, I just want to thank everybody for making it tonight. It's just so amazing to still have the community that we have, even if it has to be a little virtual right now. But it just means the world to us that you guys keep us in business. So cool.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Glad you're there. All right.
Thank you. Everyone saying thank you. Please, if you do need to get some books or the ones that we have in stock, her previous books, give us a call at the store. It's 541-306-6564 or roundaboutbookshop.com. And very otherwise, please, everyone, enjoy your weekend and vote.
Yes, votes. Exactly.
So,
take care.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Night.